Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is a Great Big History Podcast. Progress, backlash, health, and trauma. The Nile ain't just a river in Egypt. Old Kingdom Egypt and the problem of things being too good. Imagine having that problem where things were too good. Well, Egypt had it. Egyptian geography, because we always start with geography. Egypt is in the northeast corner of Africa. It is in Africa, but is not African. The Egyptians don't think of themselves as African. Other civilizations don't think of themselves as African. I mean, the Romans don't call Egypt. They call Egypt, Egypt. They don't call it Africa. Africa for them was Carthage, was Algeria, was Tunis. Even other Africans don't consider the Egyptians to be African. Why? Because of geography. They're on a river between two deserts. So it's almost impossible to get to them over land from the east or the west. And then there's the cataracts, which are blockages in the river that hurt connections between Africa and Egypt. It's hard for Egyptians to go up the river to Africa, and it is hard for Africans to come down the river into Egypt. So geography isolated Egypt from everyone. They had protection from invasions, something the Mesopotamians have no, right? We've talked about invasion after invasion after invasion, nomads. There are no nomads threatening the Egyptians. They have protection, but that means they're behind other civilizations in some things. We're going to talk about China. China is likewise so far east in Asia that it's not connected to the other major civilizations. So they had to invent things. Some things they're advanced in. Some things they're way behind in. So that's Egypt. So the Nile is what allows Egypt to be Egypt. In fact, Egypt in the ancient world is the Nile. There is no land of Egypt, including deserts. Who wants the deserts? There's no kingdom of Egypt where like, oh, I own the deserts. No. The Nile is Egypt, and allows for life in the middle of a desert. And the Nile flooded for 3 months every year. Every year. Floods. Everything is 10 feet underwater. For 3 months. You can't do any work. Your fields are underwater for 3 months every year. And that is not a trauma. Remember, Gilgamesh has a flood, and it is the most traumatic thing. Genesis has, the Hebrews have taken that story, but they have their own flood story where 99.999% of the world is dead. It's basically one family, Noah, and his kids and their husbands and wives. And that's it. It's a trauma in Mesopotamia. It's not a trauma in Egypt. Why? Because it's predictable that every year, if the Nile flooded for 3 months, that would be a trauma. But that it's every year makes it predictable, which makes it usable. You can build canals. You can build levees. You know what's going to happen, so you can prepare for it. Where do you build your house? 11 feet in the air. If everything's 10 feet underwater, you build 11 feet in the air. Boom, done. You're fine. And that allowed for the Egyptians to get 3 to 5 harvests a year versus maybe 1 in Mesopotamia. So Egyptian farmers loved life. They loved their gods. Their gods are nice. Egyptian life is nice. They're the only people in the ancient world where everything is just wonderful. The afterlife is nice. The afterlife is so nice, it's your regular life, just longer. Not bad. You have to really, look at Christians, right? You die and you get a better life, which tells you early Christians looked at life as hard and terrible. So you didn't want to redo it. You got a better life. You got to be a Christian and you got, woohoo, better life, right? That's salvation. The Egyptians are like, no, man. I'm a farmer. When I die, I want to wake up and be a farmer. I'm going to be a farmer forever because it's awesome to be a farmer. And pharaohs love being pharaohs. They love being kings. Alexander the Great loved Egypt. But this makes that 3 to 5 harvests per year make the Egyptians the richest people per capita in the ancient world. And it makes Egypt the richest place. Babylon's more advanced, right? Babylon's going to have writing first. It's going to have calculus. It's going to have math. It's going to invent time, right? The 60 minutes. 60 seconds and 60 minutes. 60 seconds makes a minute. 60 minutes make an hour. That's Babylonian. When we count time, we're counting Babylonian time. They have the lunar calendar, right? Egyptians don't have a lunar calendar. They don't need one. They have the flood calendar. It floods or it's not. Done. So life is good. The average American makes $50,000, $60,000. Imagine if you made $150,000 for doing the same job everyone else was getting $50,000 for. And you got 3 months off a year. Now, I'll have students who go, wait, but they can't work. They could make more money. Why? Everything's underwater. There is no work. You don't have to work. It is the greatest excuse to take a vacation ever invented. Hi, I'm taking June, July, and August off. You're not working? Well, everything, and I mean everything, is underwater. Where would you like me to work? I'll get in a boat. And do what? Might as well fish. What would you like me to do? Well, you could work in the desert. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? I'm going to work in the desert when I could take vacation. Do you know how hard working in the desert is? It's hot in the desert. It's July in the desert. I'm taking a vacation. And so Egyptians loved life, which is a problem because if everything is great and there's lots of money and no invasions, which means you don't have to have an army, right? You don't have to have walled cities because there's no nomads. How do pharaohs get legitimacy? Everything we've talked about from the beginning of the first cities in Sumer all the way to Persians building Persepolis is the idea that war creates legitimacy. The war either attacking other people or defense against being attacked gave you legitimacy. Egypt doesn't have that. They have no war. So how do pharaohs get legitimacy? Pyramids. I know I laughed about working in the desert. And where are pyramids going to be built? In the desert during the flood time. That's when they're going to be built. So yes, it's ridiculous to build the pyramids in the ancient world. It is. It is ridiculous to do. They still do it. Why? To gain legitimacy. So let's talk about this. First, slaves did not build the pyramids. That is incredibly important. In fact, it is so important that if you learn just one thing from this class that you tell your grandbabies about. Old Professor Gennari taught me one thing and only one thing, and I still have it in my 127 years. Slaves did not build the pyramids. Learn it, grandchildren, and know it. Slaves did not build the pyramids, said Professor Gennari. Yes, that's the only thing I need you to know. Really. 100 years from now, when you're an old person reciting poetry to your great-great-grandbabies, I want you to know slaves did not build the pyramids. It is a racist misreading of history and the Bible. How? Because 19th century British rich folk didn't really like doing hard work. They're called gentlemen, gentle ladies. Gentle is the important part. They don't work. They don't have calluses on their hand. They don't go out in 100-degree weather and work in the fields. So in the late 19th century, the British Empire is expanding. British tourism is expanding with it. The Thomas Cook tours. And one of the places everybody wants to go see is Egypt. They're getting artifacts, mummies, back from Egypt. They're stealing them from the Egyptians because they don't believe the Egyptians are sophisticated enough to be worth keeping this stuff. I mean, they just left it in the ground, for God's sakes. They could have put it in the British Museum in London. So the British are going to have to put it in the British Museum in London. But they basically taught kids the only two things they knew about Egypt. One, the pyramids are there. And two, the Hebrews were, quote, slaves in Egypt. Because Exodus says so. And this is the 19th century. There's no archaeology to really know were the Hebrews there in Egypt. And no, the Hebrews were not slaves in Egypt. Like, there is no evidence that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. Hebrews were slaves in Babylon. That, lots of evidence, and two cultures affected by it. But there's no evidence. You would think if you had 250, 500,000, 1 million people as slaves in a country, the Egyptians would have written it down. Like, do you know how much of Southern literature is about enslaving black folk? Our Constitution has entire sections about it. How much they're worth as people, as voters, even though they don't vote. We have it all over the place. Southern slave owners in the southern United States wrote about slavery and enslaving people all the time. They left plenty of records of how much things cost, of what the auctions were like. So that the Egyptians didn't write any of this down for 100 years is kind of insane, right? It's just insane. It's insane. But nobody knew that. And that's fair. It said it. Nobody knew that it was fake. It wasn't fake. It's just they didn't know it was wrong. It was a story. They didn't know it was a story. It's a moral story. So they just didn't know. So they said, okay. Now here's the thing. The Bible doesn't say they built the pyramids. In fact, we know that even if the Hebrews were, if you took Exodus and said it's history, and it's not, but even if you did, who's the Pharaoh? The Pharaoh is Ramses. That's a new kingdom Pharaoh name. There are no Ramseses when the pyramids were built. In fact, the pyramids were built 1,500 to 2,000 years earlier. Moses is more close to hanging out at your dinner table than to see the pyramids be built. That's how old the pyramids were. But the British don't know this, and so the British have their racism, and they say, well, the Egyptians can't possibly have built this stuff, and it looks like it's really hard, and so slaves must have built it, because who does work in 19th century Britain? Not good people. Slaves. Peasants. The lower classes. That's who does the work. And so they took two things that they thought they knew and smushed them together. But here's the thing. There is no legitimacy in making slaves do work. Slaves don't like being enslaved. We talked about that with the Assyrians. We talked about that with the Persians. Enslaved peoples don't like working for somebody else. Duh. And the whole point of the pyramids is to gain legitimacy. Second, there are no slaves. There are no war. Where would you get slaves? That means Egyptian pharaohs enslaved fellow Egyptians. Do you know how insane that is? You don't enslave your own people, because then you don't stay in charge very long. It's very simple. You enslave other people you captured, and then you bring into your society so they are a minority. and they do the work. And if they revolt, you have a majority that can put down that revolt. Ha ha. If you enslave your own people, you are bad. Wait till we get to China, Qin, China, right? Where he does treat the Chinese as slave labor. It doesn't end well for his dynasty. So, and we already did. Ramses is a new kingdom dynasty name. And the pyramids were built 1,500 to 2,000 years before Exodus. Like, it's just racism. So if you ever see slaves did not build the pyramids, it's just racism. Saying that Egyptians couldn't possibly build something so awesome. But building a pyramid is actually not hard. Because they're not empty. I know in video games they're always empty and they're like a modern building. They're not. There's very little air. There's probably more air in like your bedroom in a modern house than there is free space in a pyramid. Look at a pyramid when like cheerleaders make it. There's no air. There's no space. They're shoulder to shoulder. Why? Because the walls at the bottom have to hold up all of the weight above it. So the only way to keep the bottom from breaking is that you taper it. So how tall is a pyramid? I could tell you how tall is a pyramid. I mean, I'm not really good at math, so someone who's better at geometry than me could like really use some equipment and tell you to the exact foot it would be. But it's your base. How big is your base? How wide is that base? That tells you how tall it's going to be. The wider the base, the taller the thing. Done. It's not hard because it's a problem of weight. It's all stone. There's no air holding up. You know, in a modern building, we have steel, so we could push the walls out. So most rooms, look at your classrooms, it's almost all air. The ceiling is held up by the walls. So the ceiling is held up. It's put onto some kind of bracket or frame, but the bracket or frames are hooked into the walls. And even the walls aren't continuous. There's the studs. There's, 2x4s or steel every couple of feet. That's the thing that keeps freaking people out about the World Trade Center. And they keep going, how did these buildings come down? The buildings were mostly air. There's very little steel holding up this massive amount of weight. So as soon as the fire weakened the steel, just the heat, the constant hours of fire weaken the heat. And plus, remember, there's two giant holes where there was no steel. So what happened? It weakened, and the moment that the place where the fire was and the weakened steel was started to bend, all of that billions of tons above it came down. And the moment it came down, it brought down everything below it because there was mostly just steel, mostly just air. I'm sorry, it just is. But a pyramid is solid. The stones are put so that every stone underneath is holding up some of the weight above it. So I'm not saying they're simple, but I'm saying the math is not ridiculous. There's pyramids in other places. South America, Central America, Africa, they're there. The question, so you go, well, why don't more people build them? Why? They have a little bit of space where you put a dead guy. That's a lot of effort. That's a lot of money to put a dead person. And remember, Egypt doesn't have that much space, right? So remember, slaves did not build the pyramids. So what matters about the pyramids? Size matters. Size matters about the pyramids. Gentlemen, don't let anyone tell you that the size of your pyramid doesn't matter, because it does. It matters a whole lot. Everyone's going to judge you by the size of your pyramid. Why? 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 Because bigger pyramids do a better job? No, they don't. No. We just explained why. They're not better at their jobs. In fact, they might be more problematic because the size matters, because it represents. It represents legitimacy, wealth, and time. It represents the ability to get other people and work for you. It represents the amount of money you spent to build your pyramid. It represents the amount of time you were as pharaoh, because no one's building your pyramid after you're dead. So you want to build as big of a pyramid as you can, because the bigger it is, the more important you are, the more awesome you are as a pharaoh, because you had more money, you had more wealth, and you had more time, because you only have 3 months per year to get 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 50,000 people to work for you. And then they all go home. The moment the floods recede, they're back farming. They don't got time for you in the desert. So your size represents your legitimacy. So what you really want to do is build as big of a pyramid as possible, cap it off at the top, put your capstone on it, and then die like within 6 months. That's what you want to do before the next flood happens. That would be perfect. And if you could do that, look at Khufu's pyramid. Khufu's pyramid is the biggest things humans will build for the next 3,000 years. Basically to the big cathedrals of Europe. Khufu's pyramid is 485 feet tall. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which we talked about as a mechanical marvel, that are able to pump, without pumps, water uphill against gravity. Khufu's pyramid is 7 times the size of the Hanging Gardens. So remember when I said when you go to Babylon, you've never seen anything like this? This is the pyramids. When you go to Egypt and you see the pyramids, there is nothing existing like it. It is massive. So how did Khufu build it? Well, he needed basically 50,000 or so people every year for 20 years. To show up every summer. So people have to want to work for you. The size represents that people like you because they came to work for you. They could have stayed home. They're on vacation. They don't have to do this. But it's also the massive expense. You pay them to show up. They're not coming for free. You have to feed them. You have to give them entertainment. So why doesn't the Old Kingdom last forever? And one of the reasons it doesn't last is actually pyramids. After Khufu, which is the biggest of the pyramids, the pharaohs after Khufu, pharaohs are not as good at building pyramids and running the government at the same time. The pyramids were so important to legitimacy that basically pharaohs after Khufu became builders in chief rather than kings, rather than governors. And so what they did was let the nobility run local government. The pharaoh could concentrate on building his pyramid because his pyramid is his legitimacy, and so he lets the nobility run the local government. But that also means the nobility needs money to run local government. Like, they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. And so the pharaoh has to send money their way to fix things. Oh, we need to pick up all the dog poop in the local park. So I need to hire dog poop picker-uppers. And so the pharaoh says, okay, no problem, I'll send you some money. See, Khufu was good enough that he was able to do the job of king and the job of pharaoh and the job of builder. The guys who come after him aren't able to do the balance. They're not able to achieve it. They're not as good. So their pyramids get smaller. And what we see is that money go into nobility, especially in what's called the obelisk, Obelisk. These structures that go 75 feet into the sky. these needles that go into the sky, which are advertisements for the nobility. And then one day, a pharaoh who lived a very long time dies. And no one really cared. Why? Because all the pharaoh was doing was building a small pyramid. The local nobility were actually doing the job. So people looked to the nobility as legitimate. And the pharaoh was this dude who was far away, working in the desert. And he didn't have much money. So he wasn't hiring all that many people. So who cares? The local noble guy, he's the guy I have to who gets stuff done. And so we see obelisks rise, showing nobles now have legitimacy. And so the old kingdom, we watch it waste away. We watch it fade away. The pyramids start, and they start small because they're trying to figure out how to build them. And then they start getting really big as like they gain the confidence. They know how to build them, but now they need the resources. And then they get to Khufu. And then they fade. They start getting smaller. And you could just watch the old kingdom fade away. And then you watch obelisks start to be built. And so you can see, while the obelisk is nowhere near as big as the pyramids, the nobility is not fighting with the pharaoh. They're homeboys. They're all working together. But what's happening is you're watching power move. Power never disappears. We're watching power go from the pharaohs into the nobility. We're watching legitimacy slowly fade from one group and be picked up by another. All right. Thank you. Be safe.